Diane here from Backroad Buddies, and the video we want to share with you today is about European trip planning. Now, a couple of years ago, we did a video on how we plan our long trips, but those were either in our camper van or our Winnebago Echo RV, and they were going around the United States and Canada. So when we started planning our trip for Europe in 2025, which also was a long trip, it was almost 7 months long. It was a lot more involved and there was a lot more things to consider when we were planning than when we're doing an RV trip around the United States. So we thought we'd do a video here and show you pretty much the same steps that we followed on our normal long trips, but how each step was different for Europe, and some other considerations we had to take into account for Europe. So if you just want to jump to a particular section, if you look in the description below, there is a timeline so you can jump right to a particular step in our planning process. So hopefully this will help you. So step one in the process is to come up with an overarching theme or goal for the trip. So our overarching theme for Europe was just that Europe. That's a rather broad goal, but we kind of broke it down. The whole trip really was sparked by Keith wanting to go back to Oktoberfest in 2025 because that was a big wedding anniversary year for us. So we lived in Germany from 1989 to 91, and we'd been to quite a few Oktoberfests in the past while we were living over there. So Keith wanted to go back for nostalgic reasons because it really holds a lot of good memories for him. And I don't like to fly, so especially an overnight flight. I just don't fit in an airline seat very well. And so I thought, if we're going to go over to Europe, we're going to stay a while. And so that's when we kind of expanding this trip more than just Oktoberfest. Now, since we had already seen a lot of places in Europe, we kind of did a mixture. We went to quite a few places we had never been to before, and then we also revisited some places that we liked and wanted to see them again. And then we also stressed experiences over just seeing tourist sites. So we included a lot of hiking and cycling and even a cooking class in Lake Como and things like that, where we had experiences instead of just going to see the sights. And then also, we didn't stress the big, large cities. We're called Backroad Buddies after all, so we tried to really emphasize the smaller little towns and villages and really get to know the people and the culture a little better. Step two in the process is to kind of define a rough route of what we're going to do. Now, coming up with a rough route was a little harder to do for Europe than in the States. Usually in the States, we knew that we were starting and ending at our house, and we're kind of making a big general loop is what we normally do. And we know we're driving everywhere. In Europe, we didn't necessarily have to start and stop at the same location because we would be flying or whatever over and flying back, so we could have a start point different than our end point. Now, we wanted to see some of the places we hadn't been, so some of the places we hadn't been to before or had not spent a lot of time in were countries like Spain, Portugal, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And then we knew we wanted to spend a lot of time in the Alps, so that meant France, Northern Italy, Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, of course, for the Oktoberfest. Now, as we started to research Europe, we learned about the Schengen area. Now, the Schengen area, in case you haven't ever heard of it either, it's somewhat the European Union or the EU, but there are a couple of exceptions. So some countries that are part of the EU that are not part of the Schengen and vice versa. But for the most part, it's the EU. Now, why is that important? Well, Schengen area has some travel restrictions on the whole area. So if you are not an EU citizen and you're coming over, you can stay for 90 days without a visa in the Schengen area. And then that's out of a 180-day sliding window. So that meant we couldn't, if we were planning on traveling like 6 months or so like we normally do, we couldn't spend that all in the Schengen area. So that kind of limited things right off the bat. So we actually eliminated Spain and Portugal right away because it was just hard to work out. So we ended up, our rough route was we'll spend about 3 months up in the United Kingdom and Ireland. And even though Ireland is part of the EU, is not part of the Schengen. So all those countries are not in the Schengen. So we spent 3 months up there, and then we worked our way down to the Alps and spent the rest of the time around in the Alps, and then ended up in Munich. So that was our rough route. Step 3 was to make a wish list of the things we wanted to see and do in each country. Now this step, when we would travel around the United States, usually was per state and not per country, or province in Canada. But in Europe, we did it per country. And what we relied on heavily to come up with the wish list per country was Rick Streve's travel book. So I read through each one of those travel books on the different countries and kind of highlighted what sounded interesting to us. And then we also relied on YouTube videos of other travels that people have done. And so we added quite a bit to our wish list at this point, actually some pretty big items. So the big items we added were a hike and bike tour in the Cotswolds in England, doing a narrowboat cruise on the canals and also in England, doing a River Rhine cruise from Amsterdam down to Switzerland, and also hiking the Tour de Mont Blanc, which is a long-distance hiking trail around the base of Mont Blanc that goes through France, Italy, and Switzerland. That's 100 miles long. Step 4 is to make a Google My Maps of the wish list so you can see it country by country where all those things are that you want to see and do and how they're scattered around the country. And this helps visualize it so you can kind of figure out how to visit them and what things you want to leave on and off your list. So our wish list went into a spreadsheet, and once you have it in a spreadsheet, it is easily imported into Google My Maps, and then it'll show you on the map, and you can see all the points that you have in your spreadsheet. So here's an example of a spreadsheet of our wish list. This is for Ireland, all the items we kind of came up with, and put that in a spreadsheet. And then we would import that spreadsheet into Google My Maps, and you see it'll show you where all those locations are on the map, so it makes it easier to visualize. Step 5 is to identify the order or route per country. So again, this was per country and not by state like we normally would do. And so this is where a lot of times items on our wish list would get removed because they would be out of the way as we tried to figure out how we were entering the country and kind of making a loop around the country and exiting the country. And we kind of had to determine where we were entering and exiting from, because that kind of determined what our route was. So for Ireland, we knew or had researched that the way to get over there from England, if we weren't in a car, was to take a ferry over from Holyhead, Wales, because that was the only ferry that would allow pedestrian traffic, and that would go over to Dublin. So we kind of knew for Ireland we would be starting and ending in Dublin. So here's an example of Ireland, how we kind of planned out a route, trying to pick up a lot of those wish list items. And we eliminated some from the list because they were kind of out of the way. And we just kind of, it was easily visualize kind of how to make a loop and make that. Now, we knew we had to go in and out of Dublin because that was where the ferry came over from. Step 6 is to start an itinerary list in a spreadsheet. So again, we went back to our spreadsheet, and now instead of just the wish list of things to see and do, they were actually locations. So yes, we'd be in Dublin, we'd go down to Kilkenny, and we kind of merged it all together, all the countries together. So it was one big long list and the order we would visit each location. So this is the start of the itinerary, what it looked like. So I just list each location that we were planning on stopping at. So here's Ireland. You notice we come back to Wales, and then we went on to England, then went on to Scotland. So it's just one big, huge, long list of locations in the order we wanted to visit them in. Step 7 is to refine the itinerary by looking at how long it takes to get from one location to another. Now again, for Europe, this is much more complicated than doing it in the States. In the States, we just had to we could easily look it up on Google Maps, going from one location to another by roads and about how long it was going to take, what the distance was. And so we actually had our spreadsheet set up to calculate the distance and driving time between each location. But for Europe, it was a little more complicated. For one, we had to figure out how we were getting from one location to another, because it may be by train, it may be by boat, it may be by car. We decided to rent a car in a few places. And how would we get from let's say our lodging to our car rental agency or train station and all those logistics. So it was a lot more complicated. And along these lines, sometimes we would add another location just to break up a travel day. So that was kind of how Conwy, Wales ended up on our itinerary, because we knew we had to take a ferry from Holyhead to Dublin, and that was going to take most of the day. So we wanted to kind of stage ourselves a little closer to Holyhead. So we spent 2 nights in Conwy on the way to Ireland, and then spent another 2 nights in Conwy on the way back. Step 8 is to start setting the dates for each location. Now, we've found in the past that our sweet spot for staying in a location is about 4 nights. We like to travel slow. We like to take our time and get to know an area. Now, there are times where we needed to move a little faster just because of the timing of things, or it didn't seem like there was going to be a whole lot in that particular location. And if it was a place where we knew there was a lot to see and do, we would extend it to 5, maybe even 6 nights. But on average, we spent about 4 nights on each location that we went to. So we kind of started setting the dates and seeing how everything lined up. Now, it was about this time in this step of the process that we decided actually not to fly over to Europe, but to take a transatlantic cruise, which went from Fort Lauderdale up to Southampton in England. Now, that's a repositioning cruise. The one we chose was by Princess, so it only goes once a year because they're repositioning their cruise ships. So that kind of set our start date. And then, of course, Oktoberfest set our end date, so that kind of set the boundaries of how much we could fit in between and what those dates look like. So when we were laying out the dates, we kind of had to make sure we started in Southampton and ended up in Munich at those particular dates, and kind of laid everything else out in between. That also meant that we booked our cruise very early. It was over a year in advance, because we knew if we couldn't get on that cruise, then that would throw off the whole itinerary and all the other dates, and it would have a big ripple effect along there. So we got those start date and end dates kind of fixed, if you will, and we actually flew back from Munich then at the end. So we kind of set those 2 in stone and then kind of worked out everything else in between. Now here's the itinerary spreadsheet. As you see, we started to add dates. You notice most of the time I said 4 nights, but there's a couple in there that kind of violated that. Oh, because we went over to the island of Inishmore, so that was just a one night, and then we came back. And then Conwy, like I said before, was 2. York was another staging thing because we were picking up a rental car and then heading up to Scotland. But most of the time we tried to stick anywhere between 3, 4, or 5 nights in a location. Step 9 is to find places to stay at each of those locations. Now, back in the States for this step, we normally used Campendium a lot, which had a lot of reviews of campgrounds, and we'd look for campgrounds along our route. However, for Europe, since we weren't camping, we had to rely on something else. So we actually relied a lot on Rick Steves' travel books, a lot of his recommendations. We used a lot of those. But then we also did, just Google searches of the area. We did a little bit of Vrbo and Airbnb. And then there was some things that lodging was actually arranged for us. So, of course, on the transatlantic cruise, we didn't have to worry about lodging. On the hike and bike tour, on the Rhine cruise, and on the narrowboat canal cruise, we didn't have to arrange our own lodging. So that kind of worked out. Nice that we didn't have to do those, but a lot of the other ones, we actually tried to mix it up a little bit. We normally stayed in like small little bed and breakfast places, B&Bs, just little family runs. We tried to stay away from the chains. We really wanted to, again, get the experience of the local flavor. So we even stayed at like a self-catering pod, they called them pods, up on the Isle of Skye, which was kind of like a glamping cabin. And they were self-catering, so they didn't have breakfast or anything, but you had like a little kitchenette and refrigerator, so you could buy your own food. So that was kind of a nice experience. Another one was in Amsterdam. We stayed on a houseboat. And so that was kind of neat. Just it was docked on the canals, and we can go sit up on top and watch all the canal boat tours go by. So just a lot of different experiences. And then, of course, on the Tour de Mont Blanc, we did a lot of the mountain huts, or they're called refugios or refuge, depending what country you're in. And there's also Gite is another one. So we stayed in a lot of those. Now, the Tour de Mont Blanc was planning that part of it was a whole different animal, and we'll actually cover that in a separate post because there was a lot more things to be concerned about on that route than the rest of Europe. So we'll do that in a separate post for you. Now here's the spreadsheet again. You see as we start to fill in where we're going to spend the night, and of course we would kind of do an initial pass, and later on as we couldn't get reservations someplace, we might have had to change these up, but start getting an idea of where we're going to stay in each of the locations. Step 10 was research when reservations would open for lodging. Now, of course, for Europe, this was a little trickier sometimes than what we were used to doing when we travel around to campgrounds in the United States. Because a lot of state and federal campgrounds, they have a specific day and time when those reservations open up, and some of them you need to be there right at the minute it opens up in order to get a reservation. Since we were doing a lot of hotels and B&Bs, it was rather tricky trying to figure out how far in advance they would take reservations. So usually we just go out to their website. Usually I try to book directly through them and not through a service like booking.com or one of the other ones. So since these are small operations, I wanted to make sure all the money went to them and not for services. So we'd try to go directly to their website if they had one and just try to book it. And so if it was one where you could book online, you could go look at the calendar, and if you'd scroll out, you can kind of see where the reservations start dropping off and they say they're not available. Of course, that was a little tricky. Are they not available because they were fully booked during that time, or they just hadn't opened up reservations yet? So it got to be a little tricky, so I would just check back every now and then to see if they would start opening up and how far out, and kind of make a guess of when they would start taking reservations. Now, some others you had to email or call or fill out an online form. So those were more of a conversation back and forth. And we did run into a couple of places that are so small, they're like, look, we don't even start taking reservations for the year until March. And it's like, well, we want to be there, the first week of April. I don't really want to wait that long to make a reservation, because we like to make our reservations during the off season, not while we're traveling. Although that's not always possible. We were still making reservations as we were traveling, but it's not what I prefer to do. I'd rather spend my time traveling, seeing the places where we are, and not having to spend the time making reservations. So I tried to do as much as possible ahead of time. So maybe if a place wouldn't take reservations before we left, I might look at a different lodging option. And sometimes you'd ask them and they would, I'm like, oh, well, they take reservations over here soon, earlier. And, this is my good friend Sally or whatever. And so it actually all worked out. And we normally made most of our reservations ahead of time before we left on our trip. Step 11 is to make calendar reminders for when to make reservations when they open up. So in cases where I could pretty much guess when the reservations were going to become available, I would set a calendar reminder to go out and make the reservations. Others were just reminders of, it looks like they might open up, or just check back in another month and see if they've opened up yet. So there was a lot of calendar reminders going on, and a lot of, kicking the can down the road quite a bit, much more so than when we would do campgrounds. So it was a big guessing game of when we could make reservations and when we couldn't. But I just kept setting the calendar reminders so I wouldn't forget, and working on it a little bit at a time. Step 12 is to make reservations for lodging and transportation. So this step was a little more involved because, again, it wasn't just about lodging, it was also about transportation. So in addition to trying to reserve all the hotels and B&Bs and houseboats or whatever we were reserving, it was what trains can we reserve and what car rentals can we set up, and all of those transportation needs. And again, it wasn't just getting from one major city to another or one location to another. It was how to get from the lodging to the train station or the car rental office, and vice versa. When we got there, do we need to take an Uber? And just figuring out all those logistics of getting from location A to location B. Now, as we started to make reservations for different places, we'd fill the information in, what we would reserve, any relevant information like reservation numbers, how much we were paying in euros, and just any other comments or things we needed to remember as we went along and made reservations. Then, of course, transportation reservations weren't just as simple as just making a reservation for a particular train or car rental. We had to investigate and research, well, what's the best way of doing that? Should we just buy individual train tickets? And what kind of train ticket, like an anytime ticket, or just one for a particular train? Do we do some kind of pass, like a Swiss travel pass or Eurail? And it really got to be rather overwhelming. And so we ended up choosing a few things just based on some simple reasoning, and didn't really get too hung up on finding the really best deal or best way to save money. Some of it was, well, what's more convenient? What will give us the most options? Like an anytime ticket, if we miss that train, can we hop on another one that's going to the same place a little later in the day? And looking up what all those schedules look like. And we actually did a mixture. In England, we did mostly just a ticket for a particular train, but many times it was an anytime ticket. So again, we could hop on any train that was going that route that day. And then in Switzerland, we did the Swiss travel pass because that seemed like a good deal, and you didn't have to worry about making reservations in Switzerland for most of the trains. Most of the trains run on a really regular basis between most of the major cities in Switzerland, and they're almost never delayed, and they're on such a short or frequent schedule that you didn't even have to look up a schedule half the time. You just go to the train station and hop on the next one that's going that direction. So Switzerland was really wonderful. Then for Italy and Austria and Munich, we chose to do Eurail, and we did, I forget what it was, like a 10 trips out of a 60-day window or something like that. I'll have to look up the specifics, but we did a Eurail there. And again, we had a lot of long travel days going through that area where we had to do a lot of train transfers, and especially through Italy, we're thinking, well, if the train's running late, we miss that connection. Eurail actually makes it pretty easy in their app to remove a train and add a different train if you miss a connection, and it's still all on the same ticket. So that really worked out well for us. Now, there might be cheaper ways of doing that, but it kind of gave us a little peace of mind knowing that we could change things on the fly, especially if we miss connections. And we did miss connections, I think, twice, 2 or 3 times. But we were able to pick up another train and get to our destination that same day. So, so everything worked out. A little stressful at times, but everything worked out. Step 13 is to consider reservations for excursions and attractions. Now, a lot of times we don't plan exactly what we're going to see and do. Yes, we've planned our locations, we've planned where we're going to stay, and we've planned our transportation. But as far as once we get to a location, well, and we don't have our days planned out for us ahead of time. So, what we're gonna go over and see this thing, and we're gonna go do that. Now, there were exceptions to that, and that was when there were some big items that we knew that might be sold out, or we really wanted to make sure we had reservations because we didn't want to miss it. They were that important to us. Those we made reservations for. So we actually made a reservation for a hawk walk with the Ireland School of Falconry at Ashford Castle in Ireland. So that was a lot of fun. So we reserved that. Another one was the Lion King musical in London we wanted to go to. So we had reservations for that. And then, like in Oban, Scotland, there was this all-day excursion that went out to these islands, and we got to walk among the puffins, and I didn't want to miss that, so I booked that trip way ahead of time. So those types of things we do ahead of time, but almost everything else, we just wait till we show up and see what the weather's like, see what we feel like doing, see what interests us. And a lot of times we just, especially in cities, we just like to wander and walk around and see what there is to see. So we don't like to have a lot of reservations, but those big ticket items that you don't want to miss, make a reservation for. Now here is our spreadsheet again. As we added excursion information, we might have booked the ferry, rented some bikes, or whatever it happened to be. We'd add that information to our spreadsheet. So as you can see, the spreadsheet really became our Bible. Step 14 is plan laundry stops. Now this step was from our previous planning process. For Europe, we actually skipped this step altogether. And that's because we traveled light. We wanted to make sure we could fit everything on our backs as we're hopping on and off trains and hiking the T&B and whatever. So we did hand wash at our lodging location almost every single night. So we basically only had like 3 outfits with us. If you want to see what we actually traveled with, I did a previous video on packing for Europe. If you want to go check that out to see exactly what we packed. But yes, I think we only did laundry twice the whole time we were gone. Once was at a little bed and breakfast that didn't allow us to do hand wash in the room, and they did a load of laundry for us. Of course, charged us for it, of course. And then another time I think was when we got off the T&B. I really wanted to make sure some things were really clean, and so I took a load over to a laundromat and washed everything. But other than that, it was hand wash in the sink every single night. So that got old after a while, but in a sense, it was better than taking time away from our itinerary to go over to a laundromat and spend a couple hours there. It only took, 10, 15 minutes max to hand wash things at night, so it really wasn't that bad. Step 15 is add additional info to the spreadsheet as needed. Now, this was even more involved than what we normally do when we're traveling around the United States. But we would add all kinds of things to the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet was basically our Bible that we lived from. We had it stored on Google Drive so we could access it from our phones. We could access it from my laptop, which I did travel with. And we kept all kinds of things in there from, cancellation policies on our lodging, all of the, everything we had reserved and tickets for was in there. We had notes for all kinds of things like, here's a list of bars in Dublin that supposed to have some good traditional Irish music, and things like what kind of, if we decided somewhat on an itinerary for during that stay, we would list out each day and this day we're going to go over and see, tour this distillery, and then the next day we're going to make sure we go over and check out this castle. So we would add those kinds of things in there. And then I'd use color coding for if things were already reserved to pay for, they were in green. If things that I needed to do yet, they were in red, like we owed a balance, or we needed to make a reservation for something further down the road. We needed to do it by this particular date. So we added all kinds of things. When we withdrew money from the ATM, we'd make a note in there what our exchange rate was and things like that. So everything went in there. And here's the spreadsheet with a lot of other extra info added. We'd add the cancellation policies. This was important if we needed to change reservations en route and we knew what our cancellation windows were before we'd start getting charged. We'd even track when we would draw cash from the ATM and kind of what our exchange rate was. And then even activities, we're here we, might want to explore Dublin. We booked a Guinness Warehouse tour on this date. So just kind of day by day activities, and we'd kind of put notes to ourselves. So almost anything that we could think of that we wanted to remember, we actually added. So we just had a notes column of, here's some nice musical pubs to go see, just whatever info we wanted. Additional European considerations. Then there were just other items that we didn't really have to deal with when just traveling around the United States. There were things like traveling restrictions going on and changing all the time, what you're allowed to, bring into a country or take out of a country, what documentation you needed, what you needed for, a car rental. Do I need an international driver's license? Having credit cards that wouldn't incur international transaction fees, and having cards that I knew I could withdraw money from ATMs with, and notifying the banks and credit cards of your travel plans so they don't start denying charges because there's charges from foreign countries coming through, and having a cell phone plan that worked. Can I sign up for an international plan through my normal carrier? Do I need to get an eSIM through somebody else? And just all those little logistics that go on. For example, as we found out that United Kingdom has very strict knife laws, so we actually downsized our pocket knife that we carry in our backpack when we go hiking, just so we wouldn't have any issues. Most U.S. health insurance plans won't cover you over in Europe, especially if you're over there more than 60 days or 3 months. So finding travel insurance just in general that'll go over that it seemed to be like a 3-month window that really seemed to be the crossover point that a lot of companies wouldn't deal with. So that took a lot of research to find a company that would cover us while we were over there. And the one we ended up with is Allianz. I think that's how you pronounce it. Yeah, we had heard good things from other travelers that they were easy to deal with, and they actually had a plan that would cover us for the time period we would be over there. We had heard that most countries require an international driver's license, so you can get one in the United States from AAA, so that's where we went and got ours. However, we rented a car 3 times, and I don't think any of them asked us to see our international driver's license. Now, that might have been a different story. Had we gotten pulled over by the police, they may have requested it, so do with that info as you will. Now, we also discovered that the U.S. government has a program called, I get it right, Smart Traveler Enrollment Program, or STEP, S-T-E-P. So you go on there and you register with each of the U.S. embassies in all the countries and locations that you're going to. And what that does for you is they will notify you of any health, safety, weather, security concerns that happen to pop up in those locations. So it kind of helps keep you informed. Now, one of the things we had to keep an eye on was the Schengen area that I mentioned before. They keep talking about they're going to start this program that is called the European Travel Information and Authorization System, or ETIAS. And that is just an authorization to enter the Schengen area. So even though you don't need a visa, well, it depends what country you're from, but from the United States, you don't need a visa. But eventually you'll have to actually sign up for this authorization, which I think is good for like 3 years. You know, pay your fee, give the information to them, and they probably do like a quick little background check or check you off some, terrorist list or something. And you have to have this authorization to enter the Schengen area. Now, it was supposed to go into effect before our trip, and then they kept pushing it off, and it still hasn't been implemented yet. I think it's now scheduled for 2026, but that may change. So you just need to keep up to date with that type of information and know what's coming along. Now, of course, in the meantime, the United Kingdom implemented their version of the authorization called the Electronic Travel Authorization, or ETA. So that one we did had to fill out and pay our money and get that approved. And again, I think that's good for like 3 years or something to allow us to enter the United Kingdom. And we actually did have to show that on several occasions when we were entering the United Kingdom. Conclusion. So as you can see, the basic steps that we went through were pretty much the same ones we go through when we travel around the United States, but each step, most of them, other than the laundry stops, was much simpler in the United States than for Europe. There was just so many more things to consider and so many more options and so much more research and logistics to handle. So all in all of those steps, we started planning this trip about 3 years in advance, to give you an idea. Now, that was just, real rough stuff in the beginning. Probably the most intense was that 1 year leading up to leaving for the trip. But it was a lot of work. I won't lie to you. There was just so many things to do. And had we do it all over again, I probably would limit my trip to 3 months. That seemed to be like the magic window when things got a little more complicated, when you go beyond that. So that's kind of my recommended advice, is if you're planning a trip to Europe, keep it to 3 months or less. But it is possible to go longer, and there's just more to deal with and different things you have to go through. So just keep that in mind. So I hope you got something out of this. So thanks for watching. And if you want more details, especially like links to some of the things I mentioned, you can go over and check out our blog posts. There's a link in the description below, so check that out. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. Ta-ta for now.